Dr. Tabellini, Maristella, colleagues, students, friends from the university and the city. It's a great honor to be invited to give this first lecture. I would like to talk today about gender equality and development. Gender inequality is pervasive around the world. The starkest and the saddest manifestation of it is what Amartya Sen has called the missing woman phenomenon. What is a missing woman? Missing woman is a woman who should be there in the world but is not, either because she was never born, maybe because there was selective abortion, or because she was born but she died before time. In the late 1980s, Amartya Sen calculated that there were somewhere between 60 and 100 million missing women the world over. And the way he calculated that is by looking at the ratio of female to male in the world and pointing out that since there are about as many women and men born, there should be about as many women and men around. In fact, a few more women because women live slightly longer. But in fact, in many countries such as China, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, you do find many more men than women. So when you calculate that, you figure out that there are a large number of missing women. And today, more than a decade later, the number of missing women has not declined. In fact, the number of missing women has increased somewhat. The missing woman phenomenon is just one of the dimensions of the inequalities between men and women around the world. Women lag behind men in many domains. They have fewer education opportunity. They are less likely to be employed. When they're employed, they earn less money. And in rich countries, they are less likely to be present in the boardroom or at very high salaries. They also lag behind in political representation. The number of women who are in parliament or who are ministers is very low, and that continues to be true in rich countries, even unless there are explicit quota policies. The lectures could have been called development and gender equality instead of gender inequality and development, because the relationship between economic development and gender inequality is a two-way relationship. On the one hand, economic development and growth, if it favors women more than men, and that's something we are going to reestablish in a moment, could bring about more equality between women and men. So if it turns out that very stark discrimination, such that killing little girls is something that only poor people do, just by making the world richer without doing anything special, we would alleviate the inequality between men and women. So in that sense, more development can bring about more equality without any need to specifically target women. On the other hand, gender empowerment is also believed to lead to development potentially, because if, and again that's a if, but something we are going to try and look at in this lecture, if women make decisions that are better for long-term growth, for example, if they're more likely to invest in the education, in the health of their children, then giving more power to women might lead to greater development. Given this interrelationship, there might be the possibility of virtuous circle. You could maybe just start some pump that would continue forever and ever, leading to more development and therefore more empowerment and therefore more development, and the whole world would be a better place. The possibility that this virtuous circle is there is something that you keep hearing in development circles, which is not particularly surprising because the policy world like win-win solutions, and if it was one, then it would be very nice. So what I want to do today is to review the evidence on both sides, from development to gender empowerment first, and then from gender empowerment back to development. And I want to see whether those relationships exist, number one, and number two, whether they are strong enough to generate this possibility of virtuous circle or not. So this is where we're going for the rest of today. So let's start with the first aspect, from development to empowerment. So one thing there's one fact that seems to be resurfacing over and over again is that the extreme form of discrimination, such that, for example, not feeding your little girls, are more likely to occur in extreme situations, either for the child or for the family, than in everyday life. That's not straightforward to establish, because if you start looking in a lot of details in how much time or how much food parents give to their children, then they're likely to also change their behavior. Or if you ask them ex post, how much time do you spend with every child, they're more likely to give you the answer that they think you expect, and therefore to slightly underestimate how much discrimination there is. So Angus Deaton, Princeton professor, came up with a very interesting, very intelligent method, inferential method, which is to look at the consumption of the adults. So the idea is that when there is a child, because you need to feed the child, the adults need to eat a bit less in order to compensate. So they will smoke less, or they will buy themselves less clothes, or they will drink less, for example, because they need to buy milk and bread for the child. So you can calculate the price of a child in the form of lower consumption by the parents. And the idea is that if parents discriminate against girls, then you should see that the price of a girl, in terms of fewer cigarettes, should be lower than the price of a boy. So what he found, first in Ivory Coast, is that he couldn't find any difference between the price of a girl and the price of a boy. He wasn't too surprised because, in fact, in sub-Saharan Africa in general, and Côte d'Ivoire in particular, there is no sign of evident discrimination against girls. In particular, the gender ratio between women and men is almost 1. So he was not surprised. But then he redid the exercise for Pakistan, where we do know that there is a big difference between boys and girls, and again found no difference. So this is a sign that maybe in everyday life there is not that much difference between how boys and girls are treated. Another sign taken one is many is vaccinations. Vaccinations is very low in India, for example, but it is not lower for girls than for boys. It's very similar. So it seems that in terms of the regular inputs, girls and boys are treated more or less the same. Where you do see a difference emerge is in critical situations. So either it's a critical situation for the kid, or it's a critical situation for the family. So for the kid, I'll just give one example, which is a study of diarrhea in Delhi, showing that girls are significantly more likely to die of diarrhea than boys. I should mention that one should not die of diarrhea most of the time, because it can be addressed with proper rehydration. But girls are much more likely to die of diarrhea than boys. So girls are less likely to be taken on time to the health center. And they're less likely to be appropriately treated. So that's one. And then on the side of the family, there is a very, very nice paper by Elena Rose, which shows that the differential mortality between boys and girls is relatively low in normal periods, but explodes in periods of drought. This is India again. When you have drought, you suddenly see that girls are much more likely to die than boys. And another example, this time from Africa, comes from Tanzania, which is discrimination against older women. When you have a bad drought period, you suddenly see epidemics of witch killing. Who is a witch? A witch is an old woman who is not particularly useful but needs to be fed. And you suddenly see families much more likely to denounce their grandmother as a witch. And so again, this is a sign of like an extreme situation where you're thinking, let's do something about. So this suggests that if you could reduce vulnerability, so for example, if you could make sure that health care was free, that would reduce the vulnerability against health events for the kid. Or if you could insure people against bad droughts with cash transfer or with insurance, with better access to credit, that could reduce gender discrimination, even without making a special effort to target women, just because it will relax the grip of poverty on people. And in fact, one indication that this may be the case, if you go back to the study of Elena Rose of differential mortality in India, she finds that you find this differential exploding, but only for the landless. For people who have land, you don't find this difference. So it seems that when people have land, what they do is they sell their land. So they have an ability to cope, which doesn't involve starving one of the child. So that's the first reason why development might lead to better equality without doing anything special in favor of girls. A second reason is that development might expand women's opportunities. Just because development goes with diversification of an economy. So in traditional economies are mostly agricultural, maybe some industry, but with development there is more access to tertiary work, white collars, etc. And that increases the set of opportunities for men, but also for women, because suddenly there are things that women can do, which increases the return in investing in the woman. So a first example is a paper by Nancy Chen in China, which looked at growing tea growing family in China, and showed that when after the household responsibility system was introduced and families started to have the opportunity to grow tea, then because women are comparatively better at growing tea because they have nimble finger, it was worthwhile investing in the girls because they would become good tea growers. And you see in the regions that are suitable for tea, a reduction in the differential between the number of boys and girls after the introduction of the household responsibility system. Another example, more recent, is the modernization of the Indian economy, and in particular the introduction of the BPO offices, which hire a lot of women to answer the phone when you have some problem with your computer. And they hire women and they hire men. There is a first paper by Kaivan Munshi and Mark Rosenzweig, which shows that this increases the return to English language education. And the girls parents are actually more willing to send their girls to go to English language education because the boys need to go to the traditional Marathi schools in order to continue investing in the social networks. So paradoxically, the girl leapfrogged the boys in the access to these new opportunities. Another example is work in progress by Rob Jensen, where he actually went to villages and organized recruitment drives for girls, and in some villages for boys. And he found that this recruitment drives for BPO increased the likelihood that girls are sent to school and that they are properly fed. Again, because there is a direct opportunity for them in the labor market. So diversification development will lead parents to be more willing to invest in their daughters without having anything special to do. There is also a third possibility is that women's rights and economic development tend to go hand in hand. So indeed, when you look at the correlation in the data, just in the cross-country data at any point in time, you find that women have more political and economic rights in richer countries. So of course the causality could go both ways. Maybe it's because they have women are more rights that they are richer, or maybe some third thing is determining both. But there are good theoretical arguments that have been made recently, which suggest that economic growth could lead men to surrender their rights and do this willingly in some optimal sense. Our first paper is by Michel Tartil and Matthias Dopke, which argue that when there is more economic growth, it becomes more valuable to produce healthy children. And because women tend to care about children more than men, it might be efficient to give women more power, more bargaining power in the family. So as the father of the woman, and therefore the grandfather of the children, you might want to make sure that your daughter, and even your daughter-in-law, has a lot of power, because it will ensure that you have healthy, well-educated grandchildren who will be in a good position to take advantage of the new opportunities. A second class of argument is by Raquel Fernandez, which says that parents themselves will want to invest more in their children, and therefore men will want to sacrifice more rights against their spouse, just in order to make sure that their daughter also has more right against their son-in-law. And as there is more growth and you are more interested in your children, you're more interested in the future, you become more interested in your daughter than you are in yourself relatively. So you're willing to give up a little bit in order to make sure that she's doing well. And there is some suggestive evidence that in the US, the states adopted economic and political rights roughly in steps with them doing better economically. All of that is encouraging, so maybe this is where we should stop, and we should just not worry about gender inequality per se. We should worry about creating conditions for growth, and let that do all the work. But unfortunately, there are reasons to not think this is sufficient. And there are various indicators of persistent gender inequality despite development. To go back to sex ratio keep worsening in China, and China is becoming richer and richer, as I don't need to tell you. They went from 53% in 1990 to 57% in 2000. There are skewed sex ratio even in the US among Asian and South Asian immigrants and in Canada. And in Canada, the study by Almond and others also showed that there are skewed sex ratio even among Canadian-born children who are themselves the children of Asian and South Asian immigrants. So the preferences are very strong. And the sex ratio, the discrimination continues. In rich countries, of course, it takes the form of sex-selective abortion, not of infanticide. Labor market discrimination persists. There is a clear glass ceiling that persists in rich countries and doesn't give much signs to go away. There are very few women in corporate boardrooms, except in countries where there are quotas. Political leadership is also something that doesn't evolve very fast. It went up from 9% in 1987 to 18 in 2010. 19 in 2010, but because almost exclusively as a mechanical effect of countries that imposed more and more quotas. So that creates more women in parliament just by having quotas. So why do we think this is happening? Why do we think that development is not enough? Here we think that there are some fundamental reasons for the fact that gender inequality could be very persistent. A first reason is that the role of growth and technological progress is ambiguous. I gave you a lot of examples why growth would help in reducing gender inequality, by reducing the gap, by creating more opportunities. But on the other hand, growth is also making it cheaper to discriminate sometimes. So one example is sex discrimination. Before the invention of the ability to detect the sex of the child, you could not do sex-selective abortion. So if you wanted to not have a girl, you had to kill her. And most people don't do that very willingly. Whereas abortion is easy and clean and efficient, and therefore the ability of abortion makes discrimination much cheaper. So what you see is that in a country like India, for example, the gender ratios have exploded in north of India when sex-selective abortion becomes available, even though it's illegal, by the way. So one example is an ad that I kept seeing in Delhi on the little stickers in the middle of the road, saying better pay 500 rupees now than 50,000 later, 50,000 being the dowry that the people who wrote this ad thought that people had to pay. So that's one reason, is sometimes technological progress make it cheaper to discriminate, and therefore they will lead to more discrimination. Another reason is that, so a reason I spoke about the persistence of discrimination in the labor market and in politics in rich countries, especially at the top. So the boardroom, the high salaries, the parliamentarians, etc. So there are various reasons why we think that this discrimination might not go away. One is the fact that they persist very strong bias, usually implicit bias, even in rich countries, against women in having career or against women in politics. So studies by implicit association tests were done by psychologists at Yale and Harvard show that implicitly, even people who think they are liberal and pro-woman, and probably even you, if you try the test at home, you can do the test on your computer, you will find that you have a very strong stereotype against women having careers. Anyway, I don't know if you do, but I do. And I was not pleased when I found out, but this is something that is worth knowing. So we retain biases against women being at the top of the ladder, just usually in ways that of which we are completely unaware, which makes it very difficult to be addressed. And this fact that there are these stereotypes lead in turn to the fact that women or girls internalize those stereotypes and as a result adapt their behavior in order to conform to them. So this is something which social psychologists call stereotype threat. Claude Steele at Stanford did very fascinating and very scary experiments where he took college kids, Stanford college kids, very good at math, self-declared having an interest in math, boys and girls, and gave them complicated math problems to solve. And so boys and girls do them, and when you just ask them to solve the math problem, boys do much better than girls. Then he redid the same experiment with another group of people and told the girls at the beginning of the test, you may have heard that boys are better at math than girls, but it doesn't apply to this particular test. And again, they do the test, that's the same test. And the difference between boys and girls disappears entirely. So the way he's interpreting that is that the problems are hard. So the kids start to struggle on that. When the girls start to struggle, they're like, oh yeah, true, I'm a girl, I'm not good at math, so I'm not going to manage to do that. When the boys start to struggle, it's like, I'm a boy, I'm good at math, I need to get over this. So the behavior of the students, again, reinforced absorb this stereotype, and therefore affects their behavior in a way that creates real differences in their career choices, in how well they do in exams and things like that. Women are also less likely to negotiate hard for their salaries, for their promotion, etc. They're also more likely to shy away from competition. And all of this means that even in rich countries, they will have a natural tendency to be relegated behind by a combination of social norms, adaptation to these social norms, and the fact that the social norms keep reinforcing themselves. So the stereotype threat is one reason why stereotype persists. It's because the person who is the victim of the stereotype conforms to it, thus reinforcing everybody in the belief that the stereotype was true in the first place. And that means that it has no reason to go away. Another example of this persistence, is in the sphere of politics, where I mentioned that there are few women in politics, even in rich countries at the top. And one of the reasons why it's the case is that the low political participations reflect, in particular, the perception that women cannot be good leaders. And there are lots of experiments called Goldbearing experiments where you present people with a vignette of the action of a leader, woman leader or female leader, and you find that it's the same vignette. The woman leader and the man leader have done exactly the same thing, but people tend to rate the woman lower. So we found the same thing in India. We took a political speech spoken by local policymakers in India, and we asked a bunch of women and a bunch of men to read those political speeches. And then we went to villagers, and we randomly selected which tape you got. And then when you got a tape, you listen to the tape. So it's either a man or either a woman who says a speech. And we ask you to tell us what you think of the speech, what you think of the person who gave the speech, whether you would vote for them, etc. And what we find is that men in particular are tend to say that, oh no, the woman is much worse. Men who is given a woman, the men who are given the voice with the female tape are more likely to say that this is a bad speech than the identical men randomly selected who are given the men's speech. And a possible explanation is that because there is so much taste discrimination, there's so much reluctance to have women leaders in India, people have never really experimented with a woman. So if they feel that women are bad, they had never had any experience to convince them otherwise. And therefore, prejudices are reinforced by stereotype. And there's no reason for them to go away on their own. That means that all of these reasons for the persistence of inequality means that some biases will probably never disappear on their own because they have this self-reinforcing feature that without policies they won't go away. So some policies, even as countries become richer, some policies that target women specifically will continue to be needed. But these policies will come sometimes at the expense of men or at the expense of boys. Political quota is a clear example, or quotas in the boardroom. If you have quotas in the boardroom for 40% of women, well, there's 40% of men who currently have seats who are going to have to find something else to do with their time. So it's clear that it's either a man or a woman here. There are other examples. For example, many countries are trying to give scholarships for girls specifically to go to school. That is nice, but that's very expensive per extra girl, because there are already many girls in school, but if you give a scholarship for girls, in order to induce a few extra girls to go to school, you have to give the scholarship to all the girls who would have come to school anyway. So for each extra girl you induce to go to school, you have to pay a lot of money to many girls. That's nice for the girls, but it's a lot of money for the budget. And it's possible that you could have spent this money in a gender equal way, for example, providing school health program, that would have been much, much more cost effective in terms of getting more kids to go to school. So there is a trade-off when you want to help girls or when you want to help women. It doesn't come for free. It comes at a cost. So now, naturally comes the next question is that, well, if it comes at a cost, you have to think as a society or as a policymaker, am I willing to pay this cost? And why should I be willing to pay this cost? And the first reason is because it's a fair thing to do. It's, after all, women are also people, and you could think that, well, you know, it's fair that to give back to women, and they shouldn't be discriminated against. And yes, it comes at the expense of men, but so be it. So Kofi Annan, who is the head of the UN, as you know, expressed it in the following sentence: the full participation of a woman to all levels of decision-making is a human right. So fine, we define it that way, we're happy, these are the policy preferences, and we go with it. That's the first argument, which, as economists, we would not, at least, I would find no reason to argue in any way. This is political preferences. But there is another argument which comes frequently, which is an efficiency argument, which is it's not only good for equity to give more power to women, it's also good for efficiency. Not only will you divide the available pie more equally, but you will make the pie bigger. And you might make it so much bigger that the remaining share for the men will end up being bigger than what they would have had otherwise, which would be very nice, because it means there would be no trade-off. So the position that empowerment is desirable for efficiency shapes the policy debates the world and policies the world over. Empowerment policies in favor of women are almost always justified, notwithstanding the Kofi Annan quote here, are almost always justified on the ground that is the efficient thing to do. I'll give you one example. This is James Wolfenson, who used to be the president of the World Bank several presidents ago. This was when he was president. This is very typical. That's why it's a good quote. Education for girls has a catalytic effect on every dimension of development. Lower child and maternal mortality rates, increased educational attainment by daughters and sons, higher productivity, improved environmental management. Together, this can mean faster economic growth and, equally important, wider distribution of the fruit of growth. More education for girls will also enable more and more women to attain leadership positions at all levels of society, from health clinic in the villages to parliament in the capitals. This, in turn, will change the way societies will deal with problems and raise the quality of global decision-making. That's a wonderful program, which has this virtuous cycle idea embedded into it. Educate girls, there'll be more growth, that will lead to better policy making, which will lead to better education for girls, and we continue like that. So let's look at reasons why, indeed, giving more power to women might increase the size of the pie that is available for everyone. So the first reason is what is happening within the family. Women are decision makers within the household. In an ideal family, maybe it wouldn't matter whole the balance of power doesn't matter because everybody would sit around the table and make a common decision and do what's the best for everyone. Many of us do not live in ideal families. And so in practice, families are not like that. In practice, who has the high end at a moment or another determines the way decisions are made, from where we go on vacation to where the kids go to school to how much money is being spent on going out versus educating the kids. And empirically, we do see a strong correlation between the share of income earned by women, which is an indication of power, and the way the budgets are spent. This may not indicate a causal effect because maybe nicer husbands both let their wives work and are also nice with their children. But there are experiments where you can see that there is a sudden change in the bargaining power position of women, and we can see whether or not that leads to different allocation of goods within the household. I looked at such a program in South Africa at the end of apartheid when pensions were introduced. Grandmother or grandfather both became eligible for the pension, and grandkids live with one or the other. And what you see is that if a kid lives with a grandmother, if a girl lives with a grandmother, she becomes taller and a little bit chubbier. But that's not true if they live with a grandfather. So it seems that the allocation of the available money in terms of food is very different if it's a men who get the money versus women. And there are other pathways, other than income, there are other pathways to women empowerment. The resources that women control, for example, assets, the divorce laws, whether or not they favor women or not, the marriage market, so is it going to be easy to find a new partner if you were to divorce? Is it even possible? One thing you could say is that all of these things are, of course, very permanent and difficult to change. But policies are usually more transitory than that. For example, you have a temporary transfer, like a cash transfer, which are now popular in Latin America. And those are generally given to women on the ground that women are more likely to spend them well and that will increase their bargaining power. But you could think that it wouldn't really matter because it's temporary and everybody knows it's temporary, so it shouldn't really change the bargaining power of someone in the household. Because if, as a woman with my money, I come and I say, well, now we are going to do what I say we should do, the husband could say, well, you have your money for 2 years, so you better be nice to me now, or else in 2 years you'll see what will happen. So in fact, it's not at all what we observe. What we observe is even temporary change in people's bargaining position seem to change the way household resources are spent. So I have some work with Chris Udry in Côte d'Ivoire, where we show that if the harvest tends to be good for women, more investment in food and more investment in women's clothing. If the harvest tends to be good for men, more investment in men's clothing, as well as alcohol and tobacco, and not so much more in food. So this implies that the family not only is not a very harmonious unit, but is not efficient. The household members are not managing to insure each other against shocks. There are other ways in which the family is not an efficient structure, and as a result, the weak position of women leads to a lot of money being wasted, left on the table. In particular, the fact that women are weak property rights, combined with the fact that the family is not very efficient, leads to a waste of resources. The first time it was shown, I think, is by Chris Udry in Burkina Faso, where they showed that women and men go different plots, and they are reluctant to work on each other's plots, and men spend all of the fertilizer on their plot instead of putting some on the woman's plot. And as a result, because the return to fertilizer decreased, the productivity in the entire household is not as high as it could be. You could reallocate the same resources, putting a bit more work on the woman's plot and a bit more fertilizer, and you'd have 6% more income, just like that, for free. Stronger property right for women would probably mean that they would be willing to rent their plots for men for a fixed rent. So you would get solve of this problem because now men would have the control right on the plots. Now women do not want to rent their plots on men for a fixed rent because men would then expropriate them. Another instance is a further paper, more recent paper by Chris Udry, where they show that because women have weak property rights, they do not follow their land, because they are worried that when they leave their land fallow, someone is going to come and take it away. And that means that following is the way that you regenerate the land and make it richer, make it more able to produce more. And you don't do that enough, it means you produce less than you could otherwise. I've given an example of the fact that women, the power of women within a family matter for the final outcome. Women and men have different preferences. We have seen that in the family. They tend to care more about children, in particular health. They also care more about things like drinking water, usually because they're one who are going and fetch the drinking water. Therefore, giving women more political power can change policy decisions. So the first political power that you can give women is giving women the right to vote. And a paper by Grant Miller showed that when the women got the right to vote in the US, it happened differently from state to state. Following that, you do find a drop in infant mortality. So this is about giving women the right to vote. But today, in most countries, women have the right to vote. So that's not so much the margin. The margin is women are not leaders. So you'd think, fine, it doesn't really matter because whoever is the elected leaders, they should go to the median voter, to whoever is the constituency, and they should do what these people expect. So as long as women can vote, we should not really see a difference in the type of decisions that are being taken if it's a man leader or a woman leader. But in fact, that's not at all what we see. In India, they have now a quota policy which works in the following way. Every election cycle, every 5 years, 1/3 of the villagers are randomly selected, and they must elect a woman as leader. So when you compare those villages which have a woman as leader, you find that women are doing very different things than men. And in particular, they invest much more in drinking water. So this... on the other hand, we also find that the same women invest less on schools. So this doesn't come for free. These results underscore that there is a trade-off. On the one, you get policy decisions that look more like women's preferences at the expense of men's preferences. As economist, I don't think that I feel I need to make a judgment of whether we should prefer water or schools. Policymakers can do that. Therefore, this is not enough. The fact that decision change is not enough in and of itself to say there should be women's quota. I'll go back to that, however, a little later. What I want to do now is to talk about, to take stock of the two sides that we've been seeing. So we've been seeing that there is indeed evidence that more economic development leads to more gender empowerment, but there are limits. And we also seen that more gender empowerment leads to different policy decisions, sometimes better, sometimes not necessarily better. There are also limits. So is it the case that women empowerment always goes in the right direction towards things that are better for the long run? I don't think we can say that. I think it's often the case, but not always. If you want to go back to the South African example, for example, you remember maybe that I found in my work that women pensioners are more likely to invest in the nutrition of girls. But Eric Edmonds found that male pensioners are more likely to invest in the education of kids. So again, there is this, women do something and men do something. In this case, it's, one could think that either of them are interesting. So as such, maybe this evidence is not powerful enough to tell you really we should only give the pension to the woman. So women, it is, I think, unambiguous that giving power to women changes the decisions. It's not unambiguous that it changes them in the right way. The second question is whether investing in women always has a higher return than investing in men. It is often believed for education that, and the quote, the Wolfensohn quote was like that: we need to spend more on the education of girls than on the education of boys, because women take care of children, etc., etc. But in fact, there is evidence that both women and men's education matter for children outcomes. So clearly, women should be educated, and also men should be educated. Both of them need to be educated. Keeping girls in school does reduce teenage pregnancy. So I think for fertility, for reducing fertility, and in particular for reducing early fertility, targeting adolescent girls seems to be an extremely good thing to do. And adolescent girls are also more likely to be dropping out than boys anyway. So here is a very clear example where targeting girls specifically in teenage years is going to have a different impact than targeting boys. But other than that, the evidence we have, the best evidence we have, doesn't suggest, for example, that the education of moms is more important than the education of dads as far as child mortality is concerned. They are both quite important. Another area in which it is believed, the whole microcredit movement is predicated on the idea that only women should get the microcredit because women have higher returns. Well, that's one of the reasons. Why would women have higher returns? Because they have no other access to financing opportunities, and therefore their good ideas have not already been snatched up by someone. But in Sri Lanka, Mackenzie, Jameel and Rudolph did a study where they just gave grants to small businesses. And their first result that they were very excited about was that the productivity of these small businesses is astonishingly high, of the order of 55% a year. But their second result is that that's only true for male businesses, not female businesses. That's only Sri Lanka. We need to replicate that in other countries to see whether it holds. But it puts some little bit of, it dampens a little bit the enthusiasm and saying that it makes sense to only invest in women, in the finance of women. So let me now conclude. So do we think that this relationship between development and empowerment development is strong enough to give us this infinitely going virtuous circle? I think from the end of my section on development and from the end of my section on empowerment, you might have noticed that I don't think that's the case. I think we do have a complex two-way relationship, but no free lunch. There is an easy confusion, and this confusion is repeated again and again and again. So if you want to learn something today, if you want to remember something today, it's coming now. It is not because you have a two-way relationship between two variables that it generates a virtuous circle. It is not intuitively we think, yes, of course, women empowerment, development, women empowerment, this can continue forever. But of course, that's not true. Because if the relationships are not very strong, every time you go from one to the other, you lose a little bit. It's like mean reversion. You know, if your parents are very tall, you're going to be a little bit smaller, and then a little bit smaller, and then it converges to all the same place. So if the relationship, unless the relationship between your two variables, in this case, empowerment and development and back, are very strong, even if you have a two-way relationship, it will eventually peter out, and the circle will stop. Let me take just one example. It's a slightly caricatural example, but it makes the point, which is improving property rights. Suppose that we start with improving property rights, and we wonder whether this will be enough to start a virtuous circle that will get us out of A, poverty, and B, discrimination against women. So we've seen that property rights are almost a free lunch. You introduce them, and productivity goes up by 6%. That's great. But you make families richer by 6%, that's not going to be enough for them to not starve when there is a drought. So when there is a drought and the family is 6% richer, it's still too poor to not want to sacrifice the girls. So this is going to not lead, this 6% extra income are not going to give you more empowerment that then you can use to get more development, etc. So this is what I believe. We don't exactly have the right data to prove it, but this seems to me to be the case. So to finish, where are we? Economic development alone is insufficient to ensure significant progress in important dimensions of women's empowerment. in particular, decision-making ability in the face of persistent stereotype. In other dimensions, like education and health, we might see more progress. Empowerment alone, it helps in some dimensions and maybe at the expense of others. Neither economic development nor women empowerment is a magic bullet that everybody is looking for. So to bring about equality between men and women, it will be necessary to continue to take actions that favor women at the expense of men. And it might be necessary to continue doing that for a very long time. There will be collateral benefits. Kids will be somewhat more nourished, and maybe everybody will be a bit less corrupt and a bit more polite. But this collateral benefit might not be sufficient to fully compensate the men who have to give up something in order to bring this equality. This means that we need to have the political courage to stand for equality between gender for its own sake. Thank you very much.